Okay, so let's jump in. Where and when were you born?
I was born very early in life, uh, uh, September 27, 1940, and on a sharecropper farm right in the middle of Central Texas.
And does it mean anything to you that you're a Libra?
Yeah, I think I fit the Libra profile pretty well. At least that's what all my friends tell me.
You're kind of interested in balance and like beauty and
Yeah, I think so. I think I'd be
justice.
a pretty classic Libran.
Okay. You don't live in Texas anymore, right? What state do you live in now?
Well, we're in Santa Fe, New Mexico. We live outside of Santa Fe on the side of in the foothills, and we moved here about uh, almost 20 years ago.
Oh,
I left my practice of internal medicine and retired, and it didn't amount to much of a retirement. We
right.
just picked up and moved west and started doing other things, writing a lot and traveling a lot. But we found our spot. We really love the Southwest here, and uh, we're not going anywhere.
Right. I always think of it as Georgia O'Keeffe country. I always think of her flowers and skulls and
Oh, that's you got it.
yeah.
Just yeah, she hung out just a few miles away from us here.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, that's like a pilgrimage or something.
Oh,
Um, you're shaped by growing up in Texas. Is there some kind of Texan way of approaching life?
yeah, there is, and I'm not very fond of the stereotype to tell you the truth because Texans are known for their arrogance and boasting and being bigger and better than everything. That just sort of has always turned me off. I grew up in a rural community where education was not prized at all, and
Oh,
we had one book in our house, and that was the Bible. And my identical twin brother and I were, frankly, gifted, very bright students, however, and we always found ways to smuggle books into the house and read widely. And we graduated number one and number two in our little microscopic high school, but that gave us full scholarships to the University of Texas at Austin. And it was like divine intervention. We went there and our lives just completely changed. We fell in love with science, both of us did, out of a fundamentalist religion culture, which sort of bit the dust after our entry into the university. We both got degrees in pharmacy and pre-med. He went to dental school, worked his way through dental school as a registered pharmacist. I wound up in Dallas going to Southwest Medical School, working on weekends, paying my way through medical school. So, it was a huge transition in our life from a fundamental religious farming culture to one where science was honored and where we felt right at home. And it was hugely challenging, as you can imagine,
mm-hmm.
a shock to our to our neurobiology, to tell you the truth.
Mm.
But we managed the the transition pretty successfully, I think, and I think our careers sort of speak for themselves.
Was that the Baptist upbringing associated with limits and guilt and sin, or did that not impress itself on you?
Well, you nailed it. It was hellfire and damnation and
Wow.
that sort of thing. I look back on that, fortunate to have escaped that with as few scars as possible. And after I entered the University of Texas at Austin and spent a couple of years trying to find my spiritual balance, I had begun to explore other regions of knowledge and spirituality which actually renovated my whole worldview.
Mm.
By the time I got to the University of Texas Southwestern Medical School in Dallas, I was reading everything I could get my hands on in terms of Carl Jung, Alan Watts, and the entire Buddhist canon. I read voraciously. I managed to regrow my spiritual roots. I took up meditation and went from there.
Did your parents think that you were headed towards hell and worry about you?
No, because you see, there's a way out of that. It's called getting saved. And as a young child, I don't know, 7 or 8 years old, I was saved and baptized. So I was, I was spared all of that hellfire, fire, and damnation stuff. There's a part of the Baptist faith that says once saved, always saved.
Oh, that's convenient.
Yeah, it was really convenient. So my mother and father did not worry about my soul at all. Yeah, I was a smart, successful, and they took great pride as parents, and all of that, and so we never had any disputes really about religious fundamentalism. I honored their beliefs. They grew up with it. They were comfortable with it. And so we went our own ways without having any sort of titanic clashes over religious views.
My mother was raised in a Baptist household, and I think it was kind of fun for her when she first started drinking wine. There was something, like a little naughty about it that made it more exciting.
Oh, sure. You have a degree, PhD in religion, right?
Religious studies, yeah, from UCSB.
Yeah, congrats. You got off light, I can tell.
Oh, well, we studied Hinduism and Buddhism and everything. It wasn't like a theological seminary or something.
Uh-huh.
I was raised in the Church of Religious Science, and we sang, Jesus loves us, we are strong as he is strong. It's totally positive. You mentioned that you're an INFP on the Myers-Briggs, but so much of your work is public speaking and interacting with people. So how does an introvert balance that?
Well, I've been trying to come to terms with my hardcore introversion all my life. It has not been easy. I would feel comfortable in a cave or on a desert island if I didn't have to come out to buy groceries or something like that. Actually, I would never, ever have predicted that I would wind up doing what I do regularly now, which is speak to audiences all over. It has been a tremendous challenge, but it's something that I think I have come to terms with. And I saw early on that it was either become more extroverted or remain silent, and I couldn't go that route. So I somehow managed. But still, the old introversion is still there. I mean, here we are on a mountainside in the foothills of Santa Fe. So, we feel right at home here. The deer come out and gnaw on my aspen trees, and the coyotes serenade us at night. So it's not a bad place for an introvert to be. So every so often I sort of sneak back out into the world, and then I sneak back home, and I've managed to make it work somehow.
Right. I'm half and half on the IE part, so I understand both. You and Barbara have been married for how many years?
Well, we got married in 1972, so that's almost 50 years. So.
And how do you keep it interesting, alive, not boring, maintain interest in sex, romance, whatever?
Well, I think we just have matured psychologically in a very healthy way, and we're spiritually and professionally connected very deeply. I've never read a marriage manual. I don't know really if we violate the rules or not, but I'm deeply in love with her, and she's hugely successful in her profession. She's written almost 30 books as an author, a co-author. They're award-winning books. They're in use in nursing schools around the country. So we have, complementary paths. She sort of does in nursing what I do in medicine. So it's worked out wonderfully well.
And you don't ever get bored.
I don't even know what boredom is.
That is fabulous. Do you have like date nights or go on trips together or things that kind of spark the marriage?
We don't do that. I mean, there's no special plans. We just live our lives alongside one another and support one another and love each other. And no, we don't have any special injections of high energy programs. we don't rekindle things because, we don't need to. We just sort of live our life.
Is your brother the same kind of Myers-Briggs profile as you? Is he an introvert as well?
Yes, I think we're identical, not just as identical twins, but identical in personality and psychological makeup.
And have you communicated non-locally over the years, you and your brother?
Yes, we grew up with that kind of non-local connection in terms of thoughts and behaviors. And actually, we had no idea growing up, of course, as young children, that there was anything abnormal about that. We thought that was just the way things were. We had a term for it. We just called it twin stuff. Mm-hmm. We didn't know that it violated neurobiological rules, that you weren't supposed to have this kind of distant communication. And and besides that, I'm married to a twin. Barbie has a twin brother, and she and her twin brother have had these kinds of distant communications that are so dramatic it makes my brothers and mine look sort of minor. So we've had a pretty interesting household. It's been kind of a twin laboratory around here for years, and so. Yeah, this is struck as just really normal twin communication. I mean, I've studied this professionally. I know that only about 20% of identical twins have these sorts of experiences, and the key seems to be emotional closeness. Not all twins love being twins, I'll tell you. A lot have difficulties developing their own sense of personhood. Their self-identity is very difficult for some to develop and maintain. Those twins don't experience this sort of stuff. But twins who enjoy being twins and who luxuriate in their twinship, that's where you see these sorts of things.
What's an example of how you and your brother communicated in one of Barbara's communications?
Well, I swore a long time ago that I just wouldn't discuss the actual events in our lives because of basically privacy issues. Some of them really are deeply personal. I've written widely about the events in the literature where these are spelled out, and so I usually talk about those, but not those that are so close to home.
Got it. What do you think happens after death?
I think it gets very interesting. The bottom line for me is that consciousness does survive. I think that the materialistic view that consciousness is annihilated with the death of the brain and body is simply wrong. And I think a lot of damage spiritually and psychologically has been done by the materialistic worldview, which tells people that all they have to look forward to is total annihilation of all they are. I think there are many strings of evidence now that are overwhelmingly statistically powerful that we're justified in talking about survival of personhood after physical death. The materialists don't even want to look at the data. They're sort of stuck in a paradigm that says that anything other than annihilation is bad science. There are, just as a single example, we now know that 15 million Americans now say they have had a near-death experience. You can say this is mass hallucination, but there has been sophisticated research done in investigating these things. If you pair those 15 million Americans with NDEs and look at a related phenomenon, which is children who say they have remembered a past life, and you go out and you try to verify their stories, there are thousands of those cases. If you are courageous enough to venture deeply into the world of paranormal, or the parapsychological data, the actual controlled experiments that have been done, you see that consciousness has a way of behaving what I call non-locally. Consciousness can experience things distant from the physical person. These are non-local in the sense that they are simultaneous. Distance isn't a factor. The robustness of the correlations of these experiences do not deteriorate with increasing distance. These all amount to what physicists call non-local correlated events. Talking like this drives skeptics crazy because their paradigm suggests that this is just not possible. So we have a real standoff here, and I know you're familiar with some of the research in this field because you've probably interviewed some of my close friends, such as Dean Radin, who is one of the great investigators of these phenomenon. I am quite satisfied that this data is powerful. It's replicated in laboratories around the world by some of the smartest scientists I personally have ever known. And I happen to believe that, you know, as we say, the cream rises eventually, and I think good data eventually floats to the top of science, although it may take a while. And I think we're seeing signs now that there is a profound revision in the materialistic creed that consciousness produces, that the brain produces consciousness and dies with the death of the brain. I look forward to the progress of this data. It isn't going away. It's becoming more and more profound and sophisticated. And I think that if you stay on top of the literature in this exciting field, you can see a bright future for this data because of one essential feature. It's great science. It has been replicated by scholars who are extremely critical all around the world. And there's another reason I think that it's going to float to the top. We deeply need this. This idea that it's all over with physical death, I think has spawned a horrible crisis in ethics and morality in our world.
Right.
There are many sophisticated spiritual teachers now who are calling attention to this. One is Sogyal Rinpoche, who wrote the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. And he says that unless we develop a sense of ongoing life after death, we will continue to follow a selfish ethic on the earth, which is consumer-oriented and which is destructive. Because why should I look forward to anything? Because I have no perpetuation. So it's every person for himself. You know, get it while you can. You can't take it with you. This has led to enormous destructiveness of our environment. I think it would take a blind person not to acknowledge this. And I think this idea of the survival of consciousness, along with Rinpoche, is an essential feature of our species' hope for survival on this earth. So I don't see this business of survival of bodily death as just a philosophical, spiritual, or religious issue. I see it as something that is tremendously practical, and it's related to saving our own skins.
Correct me if I made this too simple, but my understanding of quantum mechanics, non-locality, is if, let's say, two electrons are entangled because they go around the same nucleus. If we take one electron to Peru, we change the spin. This one here instantaneously changes in response. I think the opposite. So it indicates that there is some kind of information field that operates instantaneously, no wave action.
I think you did a good job there. You know, there's no signal. Signals require time to pass. These things are instantaneously correlated. So even though they're spatially separated, they behave as if they're a single particle. This is weird, unbelievable stuff to people who stumble on it for the first time. And even Einstein rebelled at
There's
this.
spooky
Faint,
action from a distance.
spooky action at a distance, that's right. But, you know, people can come to terms and make peace with this in one of two ways. First of all, you can just look at the data from physics. It's unimpeachable. I do not know any physicists any longer who argue with entanglement and non-local correlated events. That's one approach. The second approach is to honor experiences which seem to mirror the same thing. Distant people, emotionally close, can experience simultaneous thoughts, feelings, and even physical changes with apparently no energetic kind of signal. They behave as if they're single minds, single consciousnesses occupying distant, different bodies. Now, here's where it gets tricky. I don't know anybody who has proved that non-locality in people depends on non-locality of electrons or photons and so on. I think we have to be very careful here. There's no evidence that we behave non-locally on account of what's going on non-locally in atoms. These may be just incidental correlations. It sure looks kind of strange, however, that these are so identical in nature. Dean Radin thinks that this is no accident. He thinks that there is some connection between subatomic non-locality and human non-local events. I just sort of take a backed off look. I'm not a physicist and a mathematician, and I leave this argument to other people.
But there's communication between people who have passed over who don't have the same kind of atoms with people who do have them.
I think you're totally correct, and you're wise to bring that out. You know, people have been having apparitions of communication with people who died and have seen them make appearances in this life over and over again. And mediums have been telling us for centuries that you can communicate with people who have passed over. And so I think this is just one more piece of additional proof that consciousness does survive.
Do you have any kind of explanation of what this information field, the quantum field, is that allows this communication?
I think it's too early to tell. I think that our theories about how all of this operates are extremely infantile, and I think our task now is to honor the data. Sometimes theories come later. Understanding can be centuries before displaying itself. Our task is to go with that pesky little forward data. And without that, I mean, I don't think we're even doing science. I think this is where materialists make a tremendous mistake of disallowing data that's been replicated for decades, if not centuries, and saying this is just hallucinations. People are making this stuff up because my worldview doesn't permit it.
Right.
That's science. I think that's where the ideology lies, and I think it's dangerous.
Right. After my grandmother died, she would come and visit and pop corks out of wine bottles and open cabinet doors in the kitchen to say hello to my mother. Would say, "Gammy's here," and we'd say, "Hi, Gammy."
I envy you for that. I've not had that experience, and I wish I would.
So synchronicity ties in with this as well, that there's some kind of information field. I think the concept kind of started with Jung, who was working with the client, and they were talking about the scarab beetle, and the beetle tapped on the window. So
Right.
is there a correlation with synchronous events and this quantum non-locality?
Well, it certainly seems that way intuitively. I mean, both synchronicity and non-locality seem to be related in that there is meaning and connection between distant events. Uh, I have a friend who says that synchronicity is an example of the universe just sort of winking at us,
That's cute.
give, giving us a little clue that it's not all probabilistic, that there is meaning and purpose and direction working behind the scenes. And these little synchronicities are just a little tap on the shoulder saying, check this out, look closer. There's something going on here. It's not all accidental.
Do you think we have guides that help make these synchronous events happen?
Uh, I personally feel guided. I think that the entire universe is more intelligent than we have the capacity to understand. Uh, so for me, that's guidance. I think the guidance can be so sophisticated and complex that it escapes our ability to see it as guidance, and we don't. Our understanding is infantile in trying to sort out the messages. But it gets more interesting for a lot of people who have messages from the other side. I recently came across a survey of American nurses who had advanced degrees in nursing. And most of these nurses had profound experiences of having communicated with people from the other side. Now, these are not religious fanatics. These are highly experienced people who have been around a lot of death, most of them in critical care units, who are very skeptical. I think nurses are some of the most skeptical people I've ever run into. I mean, they're not suggestible, and they do not suffer fools lightly. I'm married to one, so I have personal experience here. And so if you take seriously the intimations of nurses and their intuitive abilities and what they have actually experienced, I think that's an interesting database. It's not like some religious nut is running around with a sandwich board on Fifth Avenue preaching about something. I mean, these are hard-headed empiricists. And not just nurses. There are other people out there who have had extremely convincing experiences, sort of like you described with your granny.
Yeah, I have another one, good one with my brother that I could tell you sometime. You mentioned George Dyson's books in terms of synchronicity.
Yeah, he's Freeman Dyson's son. Freeman Dyson is one of the great physicists alive working in the world these days. George went another direction. He was a wilderness type of guy. He built an Indian Native American type of canoe called a badarka off the northwest Pacific coast, and he sailed it up and down the inner waterway around Victoria Island. And there's a book that he wrote about this. It's called The Starship and the Canoe. The starship refers to his father's physics interest in jet propulsion and so on. And the canoe was George's part of the story. And it's a fascinating book. It was given to me by one of my medical associates. I just put it on the shelf, and it stayed there for years and years. I just didn't find the opportunity or the interest to read it. So one summer, my wife and I got an invitation to make a presentation at Hollyhock Convention Center on Cortez Island, which is the waterway up there that was George Dyson's playground with his canoe. And I thought, gee, we're going up there. I think I'll read this book. It's kind of be a nice introduction to that area. We'd never been up there in our life. So on the airplane and also on the ferry to get us up to Cortez Island, I was just mesmerized in this book, and I thought, why did I not read this before? It's absolutely fascinating. So we get to the conference center. They want to entertain us with a walk on the beach. And so we were walking along this beach, and there was big logs that had floated in and lodged on the beach. And behind one of them, I saw something really colorful. And I said, "What the hell is that thing? That doesn't look like a log." And they said, "Oh, that's George's Bedarka. He sailed through here just a few weeks ago, and he just begged us to let him prop his boat behind the log, and he said he'd be by in a few weeks to pick it up." I thought, "Oh my God, is this a synchronicity or what?" What can you say about something like that? You can call it
non-probable.
An accident.
It's not probable.
So that's my synchronicity.
That's great. Let's take the different areas of consciousness research that indicate there is a non-local mind. You call it the one mind.
Yeah.
In your latest book. Remote viewing. The feds invested money in remote viewers like Russell Targ, so they must have thought that it was worthwhile.
Well, there's some staggering stories of finding crashed Soviet airplanes and peering into Soviet missile silos and seeing at a distance what they were doing in the Soviet Union with respect to building super submarines and all this sort of thing. This is the reason the feds spent millions of dollars in the so-called Stargate program. It was secret. There are still stories to be told that just knock your socks off. Not everybody can do this remote viewing successfully, but when you find somebody who's trained in this, their accomplishments are just mind-boggling. There have been subsequent books by Russell Targ now to reveal as much as is possible without, giving a lot of the secrets away. Describing their anecdotes and their successes and so on. I suspect that this is still going on at secret circles. It just seems to be too valuable to lock away for forever. And I'm not alone in thinking that. Some of the people who were key in this program seem to think the same thing.
Stanford and Princeton did random number generator work where humans influence 0-1 output of the computers.
Right.
Is that still going on? I don't think Tiller's still at Stanford. I don't know about Pear at Princeton.
Bob John, who ran the Pear Lab for 30 years, recently died. And I don't know the status of the program now, but their work was replicated in laboratories around the world. Not 100% of the time, but enough to make people really pay serious attention to this work. There are some things that come out of that work, I think, that are not emphasized and should be. For example, people could influence the outcome and the production of these random number generators, which normally spit out equal numbers of zeros and ones. They could influence them after the random event generator had already run and the results had been recorded. And then after, they would try to reach back in time and influence the outcome. Now, as long as the recorded record had not been observed, they found out that they could match up their intention into the past and influence what should have been a random output, and they could bias it in the direction they chose. This is just too weird for a lot of people to even countenance, but it shows a feature of non-locality, which you have already brought up. It is non-local with respect to space. The distance between the influencer and the REG was not important, but also the divisions in time didn't seem to matter. People could influence this into the past and they could influence into the future. So divisions in time seem to go out the window in these experiments. This is so threatening to people that most people just tend to, slap their forehead and say, it's too well, I just can't think about that. Well, that's the world we live in. This is the non-local world with respect to consciousness. I'm not surprised that this kind of information offends people who are locked into a Newtonian classical worldview, because this stuff just looks like science fiction. It looks like somebody made it up. But that's the database that we're stuck with now, Gail, and not just with respect to random number generators, but there are at least 6 areas of research which show essentially the same pattern. Consciousness could operate at a distance without any energetic signal going from the subject to the object, and do so simultaneously, and also without any inhibition by spatial separation. This is the non-local picture of consciousness that we are living into, which is being fought tooth and nail by many who just don't want to go there.
Well, the same thing happened with saying that the sun is the center of the universe, the solar system, not the. I mean, it happens all the time.
Well, and also the round shape of the Earth. I mean, that was heresy for a long time.
Oh, it's square, man. Don't you know? You can see the horizon drops off.
Right. And so this is an old story, right? Of some troublemakers, heretics coming along with a view that nobody in their right mind would believe. But it eventually carries the day. That's what we're living through here. And I'm happy to be a part of that.
You know, what is it? 3 to 5% of the universe is known to us as regular matter, and the rest is dark matter and dark energy. Do you think that has anything to do with explaining non-local phenomena consciousness?
Well, I would be surprised if it didn't, but my credentials don't lie in that domain. I'm not a physicist, so I will leave that to be argued over by a specialist in the field.
You know, another interesting output from the the random number generators is that they found that the bombing of the World Trade Centers, that the phenomena happened 3 or 4 hours before the first hit. So that's
Right.
another indication that time is not linear like we think.
Well, that's exactly right. This is a field in research called presentiment, the sentiment that comes before. What happens is that if people are going in the future to view an upsetting kind of experience, that there's an autonomic predictor that occurs in their physiology before this event even happens.
I know that Radin did those with studies where they showed people slides. Some of them were disturbing, some not, and they reacted, even though the slides were selected by a computer. So it wasn't an ESP kind of phenomenon.
Right. They had no idea what the computer was going to show them. But if the future image was emotionally upsetting or sexual in nature, they had an autonomic response in their bodies that could be tracked in these studies. You're right. This is one of the best pieces of evidence that divisions in time are just not fundamental. This is non-locality with respect to temporal divisions. And these presentiment studies now have been replicated in laboratories around the world.
And that way there's no human thought involved. It's just the body reacting.
That's right.
There's no.
You could say that there's an unconscious or a preconscious form of knowing, but it's so unconscious that it has not yet entered into the conscious awareness of the individual who is the subject in these studies. So you're right. I think this is one of the most exciting areas because this has been so replicable and so often repeated that it's not going away.
I'm thinking about the fact that we don't have a theory of consciousness, and there's no understanding of how the mind and the brain are different in that materialist view. So how can people dismiss consciousness if they don't have a theory about how all these effects happen?
Well, that's what we all struggle against. They're quite successful in dismissing this because I think that they're so wedded to a materialistic assumption that these things become so outrageous that they don't consider them seriously. I think that's bad science. Scientists are supposed to follow evidence wherever it leads, but we're getting there. There's an increasing number of scientists who do look at this information, this non-local manifestations of consciousness. They know this is not going away. And, in papers I've written recently, and the book One Mind, I tabulate and talk about some of the world-class scientists who are emphatic in saying we don't even have a glimmer of a hope of how the mind and consciousness, of how the brain and consciousness are related. Donald Hoffman at UC Irvine, a cognitive psychologist, says the scientific study of consciousness is in the embarrassing position of having no scientific theory of consciousness. I think that pretty much sums it up. And it's a pretty healthy admission, because if we can't admit that we don't know what the heck is going on between brain and consciousness, then we can be open to these very exciting non-local manifestations of consciousness in controlled experiments and in people's experiences.
In the Gansfield studies, they have one person who's isolated, like in some kind of lead room, right? And then there's telepathy with a person outside, and they communicate. Am I understanding that accurately?
Yes, that's right. The Gansfield studies statistically have been very influential in getting people to look at this non-local transfer of information from one person to another who has no sensory connection at all with the distant individual.
Dean Radin says in his books that the psi research on these paranormal phenomena is so outstanding, double-blind, replicated, everything that scientists want, but it's still dismissed. So that's hard to believe, rationally.
Well, I think in order to believe it and see how it operates, you have to, as Radin has done, just go out and ask young scientists who are just starting out, why don't you go public with this? I mean, privately, you've told me that the evidence is convincing, but you don't acknowledge it. And the answer that Radin gives about why they persist in denying that this even exists is that to do so would just be almost suicidal for their careers.
Right.
Because most of their superiors, the people in power and influence who run training programs and research projects, have been schooled in a materialistic framework. And to step outside of that for a young researcher is just fatal in too many instances.
Right.
There are examples of courageous people like Radin who have said, I'm going with the data wherever it leads me. And he has been able to carve a career out of that. But that's quite unusual. And I have even been approached by young doctors in training and in medical school who face the same sort of thing. They read my stuff on non-local minds and spontaneous healing and so forth. And they say, my professors just don't believe any of this. So do you have any advice? And my advice is pretty much what Dean's advice is to young physicists and so on, is to get your training behind you, get your degree, go out into the world, do some basic research, build a reputation, and then raise hell. and talk about the evidence that you find convincing, if in fact you do. But it takes somebody who's, a rabble-rouser, maybe is the term, to actually develop the courage to follow that path. It is not easy.
Well, if your livelihood depends on it, it's not easy.
I know. And it's never been easy. We're talking about the developments in how we view the world that happened several hundred years ago. And Giordano Bruno was burned alive at the stake for his rebellious ideas about how the universe was put together. And Galileo was locked up in house arrest in the last years of his life for coming out against the status quo. So, it's an old story, but sooner or later, evidence prevails, and that's the hope that many of us have going forward.
What did Martin Luther King Jr. say? Something about the arc of truth is slow but inevitable, something like that.
Yeah, I don't remember the exact wording, but you're right. He did say that. The arc of truth bends toward justice. I think he said.
Yeah, good. I wonder if your colleagues were critical of you for writing Prayer is a Good Medicine. Did you get flack for that book?
Actually, I got whacks from both sides. Doctors who don't look at the evidence had trouble believing that healing intentions and intercessory prayer could make a difference in clinical outcomes, which the evidence shows that it can. But I also took a lot of flack from religious people, and this really surprised me. I thought when somebody came along and offered randomized controlled trials which suggested prayer works, the religious people stand up and cheer because that's what they've been saying all along. But I did something which they didn't like. The fundamentalists didn't like. I claimed that there's no evidence that any particular religion is favored. No religion has cornered the market. You see these results coming from religions that many people in the West considered outrageous, such as Hindus and Buddhists, and even Wiccans can get together and do these studies and show positive results. So it looked as if I was really spreading this so broadly that they got their feelings hurt. Because, as you well know, there are a lot of religions in our culture who think that they indeed do enjoy a monopoly on God's love and grace and so on, and that people who don't agree are going to hell. And I stood up for, spreading this broadly because I thought that's where the data pointed. So that's one reason I got a lot of nasty letters from religiously oriented folks after those books on prayer.
In your medical practice, did you see cases of spontaneous remission?
I saw one or two. I didn't do any controlled trials. It's very difficult to do that as a single practitioner. But I collected stories from other physicians who wrote about these things. And so, actually, I'm glad you asked because there's a book that's recently been written by an internist in Illinois, Dr. Scott Kolbaba, Kolbaba. He's an internist, and the name of the book is Physicians' Untold Stories. And he did something quite remarkable. He went around to the doctors on the hospital staff where he worked, and he said, "What's the weirdest thing you've ever seen?" And 26 of these doctors wrote up these stories, and many of them told him, "Well, I don't know. I've never told anybody this before in my life, but here it is." This is an amazing book. I mean, it's some of these stories are just they're whoppers. I mean, it's like somebody who had 2 feet in the grave almost had almost an immediate healing within 24 hours of lethal illnesses. I began to talk about these in my addresses to people about prayer, intercessory efforts, and spontaneous healings, and the placebo response, and so on. These stories really are not told widely in medical school because there's no explanation for them. No conventional explanation for them. But they're out there, and it's a shame that we don't talk about these more because they could give a lot of hope to a lot of people.
I think Norm Shealy wrote a book about remissions, spontaneous remissions from cancer patients.
Well, yeah.
The with these remissions, was it usually associated with prayer, or were there other causal factors that might have led to the remissions?
They were all over the
Oh,
place. Actually, some were related to prayer, but others were not. There has been one study in which the researchers asked people who had these miraculous, so-called miraculous spontaneous remissions, why do you think you got well?
hello.
Yeah, I mean, this is not usually done. What is your explanation? And people, it's almost embarrassing. People were all over the ballpark. Some said, I think it's because I took a hobby, or I did a lot of exercise, or I fought my illness. Equal numbers said, I gave in to it and I just went with the flow. I mean, I see no pattern that explains these 60 individuals who were queried this way. If you're looking for a thread, I can't see one. But it is true that prayer was right at the top of these explanations that people gave for why they think their disease just went away.
A lot of people say, well, the Harvard study of intercession prayer from a distance, the group that knew they were prayed for and was told they were going to be prayed for, not maybe, they did the worst outcome. But you point out that they had the worst physiological problems to get into the study. So why was, I mean, that's an obvious factor. Why wasn't that considered? I don't understand that.
Well, I don't either. This criticism was offered not by me, but it was actually pointed out by another research team. So everybody didn't start out at the same level clinically. That was the charge. I don't know. The Harvard study I don't admire at all, and I've criticized this in the medical literature. And I would just say, if you want prayer for your illness, Harvard's just not the right place to go. I mean, I say that with respect. It's Harvard Medical School is something everybody bows down to. But in this particular study, I just simply don't admire it. I mean, I don't think it's one of the best prayer studies at all. But because it came out of Harvard, it was touted broadly on release. And it had a terrible, I think, inhibitory effect on people going forward, because the press said Harvard has finally disproved prayer.
Right.
Nothing could be farther from the truth, in my judgment.
I think it was Russell Targ's daughter who did a study of AIDS patients' white blood cell counts as impacted by prayer, and they found really clear outcomes.
Well, right. Elizabeth Targ was the lead investigator on that study. And these patients, this was in the early AIDS days, before triple therapy made a huge difference. So they assembled people who were experienced with prayer to intercede for these AIDS patients. This was a double-blind study. And those people who were prayed for had a lower incidence of hospitalizations. When they went to the hospital, they got out quicker. They seemed to have a better clinical course. So it looked like a good study to me, but this was in the early days, and so it was sort of dropped because triple therapy came out and everybody was on the bandwagon of curing AIDS with medications. But this was one of the early studies that pointed to an efficacy for prayer and healing. My feeling is that if prayer could or healing intentions could make a difference in a disease that is so severe as AIDS, then I can't imagine what disease would be off the map.
Do you think that prayer is different from intention? because we know there's hundreds of studies. Intention is a key to having an impact on cell growth or yeast releasing oxygen or whatever. Do you think it's just that prayer is a form of focused intention, or do you think that there's some kind of divine assistance?
Well, I guess it's how you define prayer. I define prayer as communication with the absolute. That's about as generic as I can make it. I'm sort of allergic to the God in the white robe images that I grew up with. So I take kind of a sterilized view of prayer that many of my religious friends just find deplorable. So I don't think that you can, even if you say, I'm just intending healing for somebody, you're appealing to something. You're appealing to a universal method or wisdom that might somehow make this possible. I think that's a minimal definition of the absolute or God or universal wisdom or whatnot. I think the arguments about who it is that's intervening, what it is, I just don't find an interest in that kind of hair splitting. If people feel better about offering their prayers through their version of the supreme being, I just say go for it. If people just want to do intention and let that be the end of the sophistication, I say fine. But there does seem to be some sort of sense of love and compassion and empathy and deep caring that empower these intentions or appeals to God or however we want to term it. And I think if I had to pick one single factor that sort of sets all this in motion, it would be love and compassion and deep caring.
That's beautiful. You wrote a book about the extraordinary healing power of ordinary things. What are ordinary things?
Well, that was a fun book for me to write because I picked some things that people just don't think of as having healing power, such as dirt, getting dirty. There's a chapter on dirt, and when I wrote that, investigators were already looking at something called the hygiene hypothesis, which suggests that young children who are exposed to unhygienic environments grow up with a stronger immune system. They have a lower incidence of asthma and allergies. So it's good to let your children go out and play in the dirt, make mud pies, frolic in sandboxes, and scrape their knees here and there. That really perks up your prospects for better health in life. This is just one example. Have one on tearing, the ability of tears to perk up the immune system, and there's all sorts of stuff that can be good for people's health that in our high-tech age we just have forgotten about. And I try to bring these things together.
There's a church in New Mexico where they have dirt from this sacred hole that's supposed to be really holy. I have some under my bed. I've forgotten the name of the church. You probably know it. Do you?
It's the Santuario de Chimayo.
Yes.
Chimayo.
Yes.
You want to hear a little my Chimayo story?
I love it.
This is very brief.
I love it.
But after I wrote this book on prayer called Healing Words, I was asked for interviews by major news organizations, and so one of the major news channels in the U.S. sent an interview team out here for me to interview, and they said, we want to go out to this church where they've got that dirt. It'd be a perfect place to interview you about this. The problem was that the interviewer he was recovering from a cold, and when he would start the interview with the church in the background, he couldn't finish his monologue for coughing. Oh. And so I said, wait,
go get some dirt.
Let me go get some dirt. So I went in and I got some dirt, and I came back and I rubbed it on his throat, and I really did it good. And he thought I had lost my mind. And then I said, now try it. and he did, and his monologue was powerful, and it was perfect. So he was tremendously agnostic. I mean, he was not having a good time, but yet here was a kind of dirt-related healing, and they were all freaked out because they had to get back down to Albuquerque to catch this plane, and they thought they were going to miss their plane. And it was a crazy situation, but that's my healing derp story.
That is great. I really love it. Oh my goodness. What would have been the most challenging parts of your life, and how did you cope? I'm thinking that's helpful to readers to know how bright people have gotten through their challenges.
Yeah. Well, I can mention two things. One is when I went away to college and all through medical school, I was just overwhelmed by the materialistic worldview. It's all physical. Consciousness dies with the death of. I mean, I found this at first exciting, but then I thought, is this all there is? And I had a real struggle over worldview and what science to pay attention to, and whether or not I should take seriously the evolving scientific paradigm coming out of the parapsychology community and all of that. This was really hard. I mean, this was a serious
paradigm shift.
Paradigm shift for me that was not easy, and it was easily 10 or 12 years before I began to regrow my spiritual roots and make peace with this confrontation. The other thing that I found really hard to cope with is that since grade school or junior high school, I had a horrible health issues. Classical migraine headaches, not just with nausea, vomiting, and incapacitation, but the worst thing was periodic partial blindness. I had huge blackouts of vision, and this got so bad. It was stress related, and it got so bad during medical school that I tried to drop out of medical school because I thought it was only a matter of time, and until in a critical situation I would have one of these attacks. I couldn't see, and I might even injure or kill a patient. But my faculty advisor said, don't drop out. This is crazy. You're just taking this too seriously. What you need to do is to learn to relax. Relaxation and stress, those weren't even in my vocabulary hardly. And I stumbled upon, after all my training was completed and I had service in the military in Vietnam, and so this got so bad that in desperation, I went all over the country attending what then were called biofeedback workshops. And this was a way, new on the scene, of hooking up to instruments that measured your stress levels, your muscle tension, your temperature, skin temperature.
Blood pressure.
And you learn to control these machines, which indirectly allowed you a sense of controlling the level of stress and tension and anxiety in your body. Within half a dozen sessions, almost all of the headache and blindness and stuff went away. I had struggled with this for the better part of my life. It was like being zapped. I know people toss around this term miracle, but that's what it felt like to me. This really opened me up to mind-body interventions. I established one of the first biofeedback labs in the state of Texas, hired therapists, and myself taught people this technique for certain problems like irritable bowel syndrome and on and on and on. And that was one of the most significant journeys in my life at that point, discovering this through my own illness and how to manage it with the mind.
Did your brother have migraines as well?
We've talked about that. He seems to remember that he had one way back in his childhood and no more. So he knew what I was talking about, but he did not. Which deeply puzzles me. But,
was he the second born?
We argue who was born first. Actually, we're told that I was born first. I was born on 10 minutes on one side of midnight, and he was born 10 minutes after. So we actually had different birthdays, 20 minutes apart. But there were no baby bands, or we were 2-pound babies.
Whoa.
Look, just 2 pound 4 ounces and 2 pound 6 ounces. Nobody could tell us apart, so we were just kind of pitched in a pile by the doctor. And I don't know how they kept us apart, or even if they did. So we have fun with that. And we were born at 6 months, 3 months premature. And, there's been a lot of data showing that prematurity is related to mental retardation in babies in adulthood. And my brothers say, well, if we hadn't been so premature, maybe we would not be so brain damaged.
That's funny. But do you think he was more relaxed than you? I mean, was he more easygoing?
He's never taken things as seriously as I. And I think that's probably the migraine difference. I mean, I was always deeply competitive, had to come out on top, and he just sort of, didn't take that approach at all.
Do you think that's like evidence of epigenetics, that our genes express differently in terms of our environment?
I think it was also a learned kind of response. I was so competitive that I was willing to beat his brains out to make a better grade on the test. I came out in the first top of our class, and he was second, and he just thought it was kind of a joke. His attitude was, why should he engage in mortal combat with me when he could just sort of go through life a lot easier without, everything being a bloodbath, a contest. And he went to dental school, and he's one of the most talented dentists I've ever known in my life, and has just been much more relaxed than I have. Whether that's a behaviorally learned sociological coping strategy, or whether that's epigenetics, I don't know.
Or they go together. I mean, it's intertwined, right? You were involved with alternative therapies in health and medicine, and now explore the Journal of Science and Healing. Could you say a word for readers about what those journals offer?
Well, alternative therapies in health and medicine started in the 90s, and it was one of the first journals to pay sole attention to mind-body therapies and what was coming down the pike, then being called holistic medicine or integrative medicine, or there are several terms of it. And we focused on publishing scientific articles in that field. I mean, that was really new then. Not many journals would take those kinds of papers. We sort of developed issues with the publisher and started another journal called Explore, the Journal of Science and Healing, which I have served as executive editor for the past 14 years. And we continue our focus on integral medicine, holistic medicine, and so on. But in addition, we focus on papers related to the nature of consciousness, how consciousness makes a difference in health and longevity. And this, to this day, is still cutting edge stuff. Where consciousness is concerned. Most peer-reviewed medical journals won't touch these papers. We publish papers on telepathy, clairvoyance, you name it, near-death experiences, and so on. So we've developed a special readership who think that these things are important, not just in health and illness, but in their personal lives. So Explore Journal is up and going. We're happy to be an Elsevier sponsored journal, one of the largest publishers of medical journals in the world. We're peer-reviewed, and we're proud of it.
Cool. The university that I know that has kind of been in the forefront of mind-body integrative medicine is Dr. Weil's program at University of Arizona. And does Harvard has a mind-body program as well?
I'm sorry, who?
Harvard has
Harvard?
a mind-body program as well?
Yes. Dr. Benson has been very active in promoting mind-body research. Uh, he's famous for the relaxation response, teaching people stress management, how to relax, and rightfully so. That's a great contribution. Dr. Weil has, at the University of Arizona in Tucson, has the integrative medicine program in which fellows and students come from all over the United States to upgrade their skills in these same areas. I happen to know about this because I'm a lecturer in his program and actually just got back from speaking about spontaneous remissions and remarkable healings. So I love doing this because you have an audience, young doctors who really are self-identified as really fascinated by these sorts of issues. And so I get a kick out of going and sharing my clinical experience in my lifetime and interpreting for them what I think is important research that they need to know about. It's a wonderful experience. And I take my hat off to Dr. Benson and Dr. Weil for being leading edge thinkers in this field.
Are there other medical centers that we should know about that are leading?
Well, one of my favorites, you might expect this, is a Texas university, the University of Texas Medical Branch at Galveston, Texas, which has a robust program in integrative medicine. Actually, the majority of medical schools in the country currently have programs looking at the role of spirituality and health. Most people don't know about this. Many of these programs are required. Some of them are electives. But 30 or 40 years ago, almost none of these schools would even touch this. I think this is an elegant example of the seriousness of the research in this field, that our medical schools would be focusing on this in terms of their curriculum.
Yeah, that's exciting. What about future directions in your own research? What's your next book?
I have a new manuscript that's at the publishers now. It's my 13th book. It's a collection of quotations on spirituality, environmentalism, spontaneous healing, the nature of consciousness. These are thousands of quotations that I have gleaned from my readings for the past 40 years, which have been important to me in my own growth. I don't know if the world needs another book of quotations or not, but I just wanted to share these because they have been so vital in my understanding and progress, such as it is, that we'll see.
Does it have a title yet?
Vital Voices. Vital Voices. And of course, that may change many times. Who knows? But also, in every issue of Explore Journal, I write a chapter-length editorial about some burning issue in health and healing. And these are downloadable for free from people if they go to the website explorejournal.com. They can download my editorials, and I have fun in my life. I get to write about things I want to rant about, and people actually invite me and pay me to come and give talks at major conferences. I just got back from London, and what could be better? I mean, to have an audience and think that you're maybe making a difference and helping people heal.
What else do you do for fun?
Exposure to nature is the top. My wife Barbara and I, for many years, have taken the month of August off and just disappeared into wilderness. We just turn everything off, and we live on the side of a mountain in northern New Mexico. We're surrounded by nature. For me, that has been the most steadying example in my life. I have it pretty well. I get to do what I want to do. I'm married to a woman I'm deeply in love with, who is, doing and nursing what I'm doing in medicine. And I get to talk to the coyotes and the deer that come and destroy my aspen trees. So I I'm at a blessed spot in my life, and I'm grateful for that, and I see the need to give back, and that's what I try to do.
If people want to tune into guidance from the one mind, do you think there's a particular meditation technique that works for you, or the biofeedback, or what would you suggest?
Yeah, I've developed my own eclectic style of meditation for the past 40 years. I don't prescribe to people how to meditate. There are books, millions of books on the subject practically. I think the main thing is doing something purposeful and routine, sitting down, being quiet, and paying attention. I just do what works for me, and I have done that for a good many years. I think that there are other ways than meditation to bring balance into your life. I've already emphasized one, exposure to nature. To that, I would add exposure to great beauty, such as visiting great museums, exposure to art, listening to sacred music, exalted music. All of these play a role in my life. But I also find that being a hopeless introvert, I need exposure to people to lend balance to my life. And I've already mentioned that's been one of my big challenges, to actually get out into the world and do that. Mary Oliver, the Pulitzer Prize-winning poet, offered a 3-step instruction on how to live a life. Her first rule is pay attention. Her second rule is to be astonished. And the third rule is tell about it. That's about as succinct an set of instructions that I think I can offer. Of course, each one of those is terribly complicated, but I like the simplicity of it. I particularly like the point about paying attention. Attention is something that's emphasized in every spiritual tradition worth its salt that I know of. And then the point about being astonished is an accompaniment of truly paying attention. Astonishment is the proper response to attending. And then the other thing is, I think a lot of us don't follow through with, is the third Mary Oliver tenet, is tell about it. We deeply need to tell about our insights and what we think is important, not just in our life, but for the earth itself these days. I'm terribly concerned about environmental issues, and telling about it. And it's interesting that we're talking about this today, which is November the 6th, in which I hope people are making their voices known about voting. That's one way of telling about it. And then we'll see. I'm terribly optimistic about where we're headed, by the way.
You are. That's what I was going to ask you. Why? I mean, we just got Bolsonaro in Brazil, and Trump, and Oregon, and Hungary, and
Well, I think that if you look around the world, you can find uprisings of sanity that are going to prevail. And we're terribly, I would even say, depressed at this moment by this Trumpian nightmare that our country is suffering through. I don't think it's going to be permanent. And I think history helps, because as you and I have already discussed, there have been dark moments in history that actually threatened the human race, which we have somehow managed to bungle through. I think there is an enormous awakening spiritually in our country. It's been virtually shouted down because of the events of the past 2 years. But I think that we will make it. The options are severely divergent. We have the options of maintaining a materialistic, hedonistic, consumer-based approach, or we can go in the other direction. And I think it's very easy to see where salvation lies. If we want to save our skins, we're going to have to transcend our usual habits, which have got us to this serious point. I think we can do that. I think a lot of people are just not talking in our culture. And as the seriousness progresses, I think we will undergo something akin to a cultural or even planetary near-death experience, where people see that things are so at a precipice that we will undergo a transformation of our ethical and moral norms. You know, that's one of the things that happens to people when they survive a near-death experience. Their whole behavioral and ethical platform is revolutionized overnight. They become much more serious about environmental issues than they ever were before. I think as our seriousness of our predicament dawns on more and more people, this will be the response. That's where my hope lies.
We have maybe 12 years before the climate change gets totally out of hand. Do you think we can pull this off in 12 years?
I'm working. I know you are.
That's all you can do, huh? As Gandhi said, be the change that you want to see.
I couldn't put it any better.
Is there anything else that you would like readers to know about your work or your insights that would be helpful?
Yeah, I think there's a point in which it's wise to not try too hard. That may sound contradictory, but I think there's a point at which we gain balance by letting our natural happiness wash over us and become who we are. I think we can become too serious. And I really mean this. Look at it this way. The implications of non-local consciousness are spectacular. A consciousness that is non-local in time is everywhere in time, which means that it's eternal and immortal. So even if the earth were to go to hell in a handbasket and we were to lose the environment, we're stuck with immortality. That's not a bad booby prize. So in the one sense, we can work our butts off, as we should, but in the other sense, let's not lose sight of the fact that we are already immortal, that we are already eternal. I think that can help us in the short run if we keep that in mind.
And it also helps to think that we can change the future from the past.
That's good.
I mean, the past from the future.
Excellent. Excellent. Very good, Gail.
Last question. Who else would you like to see in this book, Visionary Scientists, that I should contact?
Well, I know you've already talked to Dean Radin.
I haven't yet, but I will.
I think you ought to put Stephen Schwartz
I have him on my list.
on your list. I hope you get some female energy.
I'm trying. Christine Page, I tried.
Yeah, Marilyn Schlitz, you could put on your list. Marilyn's wonderful.
Is she visionary?
She's a visionary.
Okay.
You might put my wife on your list.
Oh, wonderful.
I mean, she has a huge voice in American nurses and also internationally. She's been all over the world.
Oh, good.
In nursing circles. I'm sure that when I hang up, I'll think of a group of people.